Okay, we're speaking with Jon Gettman today. Jon, how do we get to see the economic issues as really an important pillar foundation for legalizing marijuana?
Well, economics has always been the whole story. The point of prohibition to begin with was to eliminate a market by making marijuana too expensive to sell, too expensive to be a valuable commodity. In fact, the model for the original marijuana prohibition federal law in the U.S. was that is, the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 was a prohibitive tax on machine guns. And when this was found to be constitutional by the Supreme Court, it was applied to marijuana, and the idea was just to make it too expensive. And then since that time, the idea of making marijuana illegal has been that either it'd be too expensive for people to buy, and therefore they wouldn't. The latest version of that is that it'd be too expensive to buy, so it would discourage use and keep usage down. So it's always been about economics. The real question is to what extent do modern regulations, whether state or federal or formal or informal, affect the economics and therefore affect access and control?
I got you. Now, you know a lot about regional economic development. I believe you studied that?
Yes.
Are any governments, to the best of your knowledge, hiring economists to talk about the potential impact of marijuana sales on their regional economic development?
No. I think that a lot of governments are beginning to monitor the markets arising in states that have allowed a legal trade in medical marijuana. Many states are fascinated with what's going on in Colorado and Washington with respect to the regulatory systems being devised and about to be implemented. Many states are kind of interested in tax revenue these days. I think the real focus here in terms of who's keeping a close eye on this would be the National Conference of State Legislators. They have been routinely monitoring the fiscal situation in many states. They have great reports on what states are doing to address their problems with insufficient revenue to fund all the various programs they have. And I suspect that, for example, in the next 5 years, they will have several studies about the success or failure or issues involved, both the dispensary programs and the new systems in Colorado and Washington. But states are just opening up to this. In short, there's a transition going on now where marijuana policy, it's always been a criminal justice issue or a drug abuse issue. It's being transformed into a fiscal and economic issue for local and state government.
Okay. And it is true that most states rely on alcohol and tobacco taxes for infrastructure and to keep the lights on. Is it not?
Well, I don't know if rely is the right word in terms of there's a lot of revenue sources for many states. The fact is the taxes on alcohol are a significant influx of funds for many states. And remember, several years ago, there was a giant lawsuit settlement with the tobacco companies in which states got hundreds of millions of dollars from the tobacco industry. A lot of those were supposed to go into anti-smoking programs and prevention programs and help pay for the health costs of tobacco use. And a lot of that money got leaked over into other programs and spent on other things. So, I mean, states are hard up for money right now, and they're looking for new revenue sources across the board. And sure, alcohol and tobacco taxes are part of the revenue streams, but I wouldn't say they were the major source of income for any state.
But do you think that we'll start to hear more clamor to add marijuana taxes from states that are facing bankruptcy, like California?
Absolutely, and there's already notice of this with respect to the just the sales tax being collected on marijuana sold in dispensaries. That's one of the few areas where we have data on. I don't know what the figures are at the moment, but we have data on the scope of the industry and the revenue sources. Also, the dispensary states and again, Colorado and Washington, part of the regulatory program is the cost of a license. And it's basically a pay-to-play context for entrepreneurs. In fact, states that are now working up new regulations for their medical marijuana programs, that license fee is a major part of this.
Yeah, Colorado actually cut its license fee from like $90 to $35. I'm not sure why they did that, because it turned out that the medical marijuana enforcement agency lost money. I'm not sure how you can lose money when the state went as gaga over marijuana as our state did, but they managed to lose money somehow.
Well, but there also may be an appreciation there that the revenue stream is going to be in sales tax or a special excise tax on marijuana above and beyond sales tax. That the license fee might be de-emphasized as the major source, as a good source of funding.
Are you talking about the individual user license fee, or the license fees to get a cultivation license or retail license?
I'm saying any license fee. In terms of the one you mentioned being reduced, they may have just decided that wasn't really an essential component of their funding, of their revenue stream, that they get more money off of other areas. There are lots of ways that governments tap into the flow of money in a market. There's excise taxes, there's regular sales tax, there's payroll taxes. They've gotten very good at taxing the economy over the last few centuries, and so there are a lot of options available to them.
Okay. One thing that intrigues me is how little we hear from conventional economists about the potential amount of cannajobs and the potential amount of cannatax. When economists are quoted about marijuana at all, it seems like they emphasize the personal freedom issues as opposed to the potential revenue gains. In fact, it almost seems like some of these economists could be called capitalists against capitalism. I'm just curious why so many economists take this libertarian stance and don't talk up the money, the potential money. Why is that?
Well, the practical impact of prohibition is that marijuana use and the marijuana market is out of sight. And as one that is out of sight or not talked about, it's approached really in theoretical terms. And so that's why it's viewed by, in this libertarian, should the government prohibit things and so forth. There's no concrete data. There are no concrete case studies. There's really nothing firm to talk about. There's very little data. As I said, the issue is being transformed now from a criminal justice issue and a public health issue into a fiscal and economic one. And as that transformation continues, there'll be more hard data, there'll be more actual case studies, there'll be an actual market to look at and study, there'll be dynamics to observe, and the consideration by economists or even political scientists will become more concrete over time. It's part of this coming out from the shadows. Really, just looking at the simple issue of marijuana use, when you talk to people about it in the abstract, they would say, "Oh, well, marijuana use is bad, or should be discouraged, or whatever, and the people who sell marijuana should go to jail, etc." But when you personalize it and talk about an individual, about your kid, your sister, your neighbor's child, the kid down the street, then it's like, oh, the kid made a mistake, give him a break, you shouldn't go to jail. As it gets to be real and concrete, everyone's attitude changes, and that's going to happen with economists as well.
Okay. I've also been curious, you live very close to the D.C. area. You know the city really well, correct?
Yes.
And you know how the government works really well?
Somewhat.
Okay. If President Obama woke up and had a hankering to legalize marijuana, what are the steps that he would take to do so?
Well, in terms of his actual executive power, he could instruct his agencies to begin the process of rescheduling marijuana, which even if the government wanted to do it would be a lengthy process. There's a process spelled out in the Controlled Substances Act. I think the real issue is what is the best regulatory scheme for marijuana at the federal level. many people don't realize that we have a regulatory scheme for marijuana now. It's called the Controlled Substances Act, which marijuana is in one of 5 schedules. Each schedule has different regulatory conditions. Marijuana is in the most tightly controlled category, which basically means it's only available for research purposes. So, I mean, marijuana could have its status changed under that regulatory framework, but that's not really a viable framework for marijuana's regulation nationwide. But within that framework, the president and the executive branch writ large already has authority from Congress to act. And so the only thing that the president could do, aside from making discretionary decisions about the actions of federal agencies and how the existing laws are enforced, he could change marijuana's status under the CSA. Otherwise, though, like anyone else in this country, he would have to propose legislation and get Congress to come up with and enact a new regulatory framework.
Have presidents issued executive orders for economic emergencies in the past? FDR, perhaps?
That's hard to be really specific about. I mean, you know, presidents have employed the Army to address strikes and address economic emergencies, and there's disaster relief programs and whatnot and so forth. But no, I don't really think there's any kind of executive order that the president could issue here, aside from instructing federal attorneys and federal police to de-emphasize marijuana law enforcement. And frankly, despite the federal raids on dispensaries, there has been a little bit of that discretion offered in the area of medical marijuana. I don't think medical marijuana prosecutions, for example, are the highest priority for DEA officials, for example. I don't think it's as low a priority as many people in the public believe it should be, or I don't believe it's as low of a priority as suggested by various documents and memos that have been published, memos coming from the Justice Department. But I'm just saying it could be a lot worse. There could be a lot more aggressive action being taken against the dispensaries. That said, there is a lot of action against the dispensaries now, and one has to wonder what President Obama's commitment to allowing federalism and experimentation to continue in this area.
Do you think we'll ever hear any optimistic statements about the economic viability of marijuana from anybody in the Obama administration, particularly his chief economic officers?
No, I do not. Not during his term. Now, what's going to be fascinating is when these officials are out of office, what they say after the next election, when there's a new president in 2016. That will be really fascinating. One is we learn more about their deliberations at this time, and second of all, former government officials tend to be more candid than current government officials. How marijuana policy is going to be affected by the change of government in 2016? I mean, that's the ball game right now. I mean, in terms of people who want political change, sure, there are groups fighting for change now. Sure, there's people who are trying to pressure the president and his administration or hold them accountable for past political positions. There are people who quite rightly want to change policy now. Fine, that's the way we do things here. We have an adversarial system. But the real battle, aside from people battling over regulations now that affect the profitability of the new emerging legal marijuana market, the battle is going to be over framing this debate for the next presidential election and what happens 3, 5, 7 years from now politically.
Is it inevitable that marijuana issues will affect a major election of a president, a senator, or a governor? Will a major election hinge on marijuana policy coming up in the next few years? Is that inevitable?
Yes, it is. It already has. It already has. To be real specific, the election of the Attorney General in California, I believe her name is Kamala Harris, but I may have her name wrong, and I apologize for that. It already affects state elections in California. It's going to affect elections in all medical marijuana states. we've already had the referendum that have passed in Colorado and Washington. By the way, every professional politician in those states have looked at the election returns, looked at the demographics, looked at the number of votes, looked how that campaign happened, how support for those initiatives was built in the public. But also, more importantly, if you look at the demographics of presidential elections, it's young people and minorities who turned out in massive numbers and helped elect Barack Obama president these last two presidential elections. They are the future. They are the hinge vote, the swing vote in national elections and many state elections. And while Obama did not make a marijuana policy the keystone of his campaign by any means, he did have some interesting comments about it when he was running for president the first time. He has had some interesting comments about it since he's been president, but more importantly, the key demographic groups that supported his candidacy and who basically put him back in the White House in the last election, this is a very important issue to them. And polling data has shown that a majority of Americans favor legalization, and that number grows and grows as you go younger in the demographic categories. So it's going to be a factor in elections from now on. It already has been, and that will just continue to grow.
Wouldn't it appear there would be quite a few blue-collar jobs in industrial marijuana? A lot of people who were unemployed could go back to work. You would think the Obama administration would be aware of that, or is it possible they don't have that intelligence? Or are they sitting on that intelligence?
I think it's self-evident to anyone who thinks about, looks at, or knows about this issue that there's a lot of money in the marijuana market. Now, the problem is, to what extent does this legalization, by collapsing prices, for example, how does that affect the amount of money? How does it affect the economics of the market? But the fact of the matter is, a new industry creates new jobs, and more importantly, I think, and this is something I've written about in the past, and that you're quite familiar with, is it's the money that the money that's in marijuana now is not circulating in the economy as it would if it were legal. If the marijuana industry were whatever number, we collapse it by half. Well, that other money, the money that people save by not spending so much on marijuana, that gets spent elsewhere. So it's good for the economy in all kinds of ways, both in terms of the jobs that it creates in the new marijuana industry, but also in terms of the consumer savings that get diverted to any other field of economic expenditure. So there's a lot of economic impact. There's also economic impact from the amount of money that we're sending overseas to Mexico and to Colombia and to other countries, where that money would stay here, whether it's to purchase marijuana or other items. Now, like I say, this is self-evident. The problem is that when people think of it as a crime issue or a drug abuse issue, they say the economic questions don't matter. As we get a more realistic view of this phenomenon, again, as it transforms into a fiscal and economic issue, the economic argument will gain more currency, I guess, as often said, and people will begin to say, wait a minute, we'll get a real cost-benefit analysis here.
Yeah, well, that's all going to be interesting. Just to dummy that down for people, I think what I heard you saying is, if I live in a state where marijuana is illegal, I could be paying $400 to $500 for an ounce. Whereas if it was legal, I'd be paying $100 an ounce. Therefore, I could spend $400 on fishing tackle and monster truck gear. Absolutely,
or on hunting, or on restaurants, or building a new deck for your house. And now, some of these things that cost more than $300 or $400, but if you take that on a monthly basis, it piles up.
Sure. Okay. Now you mentioned earlier that you talked earlier about rescheduling. I know that you were personally involved in the rescheduling effort. Without writing an entire book about it, can you summarize how that went, what you tried to do, and why it didn't work?
Well, it's still barely alive in one final court challenge, but the bottom line is this: the Controlled Substances Act, the CSA, lays out criteria. And to be in Schedule 1, the drug has to have the highest potential for abuse and no accepted medical use in the United States. Now, myself and the various nonprofit groups I've been working with, we've laid out very well-documented arguments about how marijuana doesn't fit those criteria.
Well, it is abused. I mean,
but it doesn't have the highest potential for abuse, and that's the key issue here. It
does. I mean, the word abuse is not the word I would pick myself or you would pick, but there are quite a few teens with access to marijuana. So from their viewpoint, that's abuse, is it not? I'm not saying that's the way.
Oh no, I agree. I agree completely. But you see, the way the CSA is structured, and let's leave let's change terminology. Let's talk about something more clinical: dependence liability. The dependence liability of heroin is greater than the dependence liability of a tranquilizer like Valium.
But that's not one of their criteria, is it?
Yes, it is.
Liability.
No, it is. It is. It's part of the scientific evaluation that's involved here. And so, for example, heroin and cocaine are Schedule 1, Schedule 2 drugs, whereas Valium is a Schedule 4 drug. Tylenol with codeine, something that many Americans have experience with. If they have their wisdom teeth pulled out, that's probably going to be the prescription they get for the couple days of discomfort. Is a Schedule 3 drug. So we do differentiate between the seriousness, the addictive quality, the abuse potential. Now, this is what we refer to as a moot conversation, because there's another important issue here. We've made a very good case that marijuana does not fit the criteria of a Schedule 1 drug, period. I mean, we've made a good case. Now, the problem is one of administrative law. The federal government has a lot of leeway from Congress and from the courts on how it interprets the laws and creates regulations. And the federal government has decided to interpret the CSA in a way that allows them to reject our claims. They maintain, in fact, just recently they issued public statements. They believe marijuana does not have a lower toxicity than alcohol. Now that's we can talk about that as an interesting topic as it is, but with respect to scheduling marijuana under the CSA, the courts have given the federal government latitude in how they interpret science and how they interpret the statutory criteria for each schedule and for how they interpret the criteria. So, for example, we say, well, states have accepted marijuana as medical use. The government says that's irrelevant. We say, well, abuse potential, it's clearly not as abusive as other drugs. They say it's the largest, most popular illegal drug in the country, therefore has a high potential for abuse. The bottom line is the courts allow the government to have a lot of discretion in this area, and we have not been able to, with respect to law, get around that tendency in the courts. So rescheduling right now, the group Americans for Safe Access has taken this issue to the Supreme Court. We're hoping the Supreme Court accepts the case and allows our appeal. We're waiting to hear from that. But it looks like if this article, for this issue to really be addressed, it's going to have to be legislative action by Congress. The CSA, even if it were successfully used to change the regulatory status of marijuana, it's not the best way to go here. We need a new framework from Congress.
Isn't it a little strange that the DEA, not the FDA, gets to schedule marijuana? Why is that?
Well, this was a debate Congress had when they created the Controlled Substance Act. And the way they set it up was, let's just talk about cops and scientists. Okay, the DEA, the cops, and Health and Human Services and the Food and Drug Administration, they're the scientists. The scientists make determinations about science and then give that information to the cops, and then the cops use that information to decide on the regulatory status. Because they have to enforce the law, they get that final decision. Now, in this case, our rescheduling petition, FDA, it was their opinion that marijuana had no accepted medical use. and that it had a high potential for abuse. So the government's all on the same page. We believe it's the wrong page, and if we were talking to a group of citizens or to elected officials or a group of scientists, we could probably persuade them of the validity of our arguments. But the way regulatory law is dealt with, the way the courts look at it, the government has the courts have ruled, the U.S. Court of Appeals particularly, that the government has discretion to leave marijuana in Schedule 1.
Interesting. Okay, so the legislative exercises you and ASA have tried to date and are continuing, they haven't led anywhere productive. Now, what if we...
Well, hang on, let me clarify. I'm working with ASA on the court challenges. Their legislative work is all they're doing. I have nothing to do with it. I support their efforts and I watch it with great interest. But my collaboration with them is they've been extremely helpful, extremely supportive on the rescheduling area. In fact, they've been one of our leading supporters in that area. And again, they're taking the rescheduling matter to the Supreme Court, where hopefully we will have an appeal. But legislative activity, I'm not involved in that.
No problem. Thank you. Okay, but what if... Okay, so trying to go through really normal legislative channels didn't do much. I think I've heard before that you don't agree that like a giant march on Washington, like 500,000 people in favor of marijuana, a giant marijuana march. Have you said previously that you don't think that would be effective either? Because that hasn't been tried yet. So I'm curious why that hasn't happened yet, and but theoretically you don't think that would work, or am I wrong about that?
Well, you get 200,000 people in Washington, D.C. as a protest. It gets a lot of attention. It calls attention to an issue. People take it seriously. But, you know, I heard an interesting comment in a different political context. It's like, you know, the left marches, the people on the right, they call. And it's the phone calls that really have an impact on the attitudes of congressional representatives these days. We live in a different time than, say, in the early 1960s. And by the way, the successful civil rights marches in the 1960s, the successful anti-war marches in the 1960s, they were just the most visible, or perhaps the most visible manifestation of widespread public support for both of those issues. And that support was manifest in lots of other channels, lots of other arenas. So anything that demonstrates public support for legalization is a positive factor. But the bottom line is someone has to hammer the Congress. It's letters, it's phone calls, it's visitation. Now, for example, Americans for Safe Access, as well as the Marijuana Policy Project and the Drug Policy Alliance, they have had people on Capitol Hill every day over the last decade making contacts, talking to legislators. And in fact, ASA has helped convince Senator Leahy from Vermont to hold hearings about the clash of federal law and state law on the medical marijuana issue. Those hearings are scheduled for mid-September. Those will be that'll be a very, very important development. And as I understand it, the idea is to get Attorney General Holder up on Capitol Hill and to get him directly to address this clash between federal policy and state policy. Marches can be valuable. They create a lot of public awareness. They create a lot of solidarity. They excite people. They animate them. But it takes more than that to get meaningful laws passed these days.
Well, I think maybe one of the major differences in the marches that you mentioned, the civil rights marches and the anti-war Vietnam War marches in the 60s, the difference there is they actually had friends in the administration. And the administration, from what I've read, they actually encouraged those marches, as in, give me a reason where I could support you. Whereas right now, even though I think it would be highly effective, there really is nobody, there is no ear in the Obama administration that would be rooting for a successful march that I can see.
Well, I I agree. I agree to an extent. Although I think that there are a lot of people in the Obama administration that are happy to see these changes taking place. In the way this issue has been so transformed in the last 5 to 10 years. I just believe that they believe it's an issue whose time is coming, but has not yet arrived. And they have to indulge a law enforcement bureaucracy that is still very opposed to marijuana law reform. And I think they pick their battles carefully about what issues they want to get out in front of. But I think that there are a lot of people in the administration who think that there are good things happening here, and I think that might explain why they seem to be missing in action. They're not rabidly against these changes. They're just not embracing them. They're sort of neglecting them. And I think they think that that's maybe the best political policy for them, but also that they're sort of letting these things continue at their own pace. Like I say, it'd be very interesting to see what these people say when they're out of office, when they're former government officials, and what the version 5 of marijuana reform looks like in 3 or 4 years.
Do you think the federal government would even allow such a march with all the laws that have been passed in the last 10 years that are sort of autocratic? You think they would even permit such a thing?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, Dana Beal and a group known as the Yippies, they have had a million marijuana march program for several years, consisting of marches held on May 1st in many cities and communities around the world. There's been
Toronto has a big march, right?
Pardon?
There's a big march up in Toronto every year, I think.
Well, and many other cities, and there's been a demonstration in Washington D.C. almost every year for the last 20 or 30 years called the Smoke-In, which had might have a couple dozen people, may have a few hundred people. It changes from year to year. But the only demonstration I've ever heard of the government refusing to allow to take place was when a particular guy wanted to get a couple hundred people armed with guns and have them march into the District of Columbia from Virginia with guns. And, guns are, such open use of firearms is illegal in the District of Columbia. And the police chief of the district said, you crossed the line, we're going to arrest you all. And that quickly got canceled and shut down. But that's really the only demonstration they've ever really directly opposed. They wouldn't have a problem with it. They just want you people to be orderly.
Okay, great. Okay, let's get to our last issue because I know you have to get to class. I wanted to talk about states' rights and the way the leading activist groups go about trying to effect legalization. It's what I call the long way around, trying to go state by state, winning elections in every state, maybe more than once, as opposed to repealing prohibition once. Now, I've heard you say that you feel that we are making good progress in legalization, even though it's somewhat halting, or do you think it would make that prohibition could be ended a little quicker if the various activist groups got together and focused and targeted their resources on ending prohibition as opposed to gaining limited rights in individual states?
Well, first of all, I don't like the phrase states' rights. I live in Virginia. We're quite conscious of an older argument with that name on it, one that resulted in the Civil War. I like to think in terms of federalism, first of all. And we have a federal system to this country, and under federalism, states experiment with different policies, particularly regarding criminal justice issues, criminal justice programs. And the idea of that experimentation is that states learn from each other. People innovate and they find out what works. It's a very pragmatic approach to things. And I think on that basis, state level reform, first of all, it's been going on for 30 years. Really, ever since the Presidential Commission on Drug Abuse in the early 1970s, known as the Nixon Commission, effectively recommended what we now call decriminalization. States have been opting out of the federal policy. They've been opting out of the approach to treat marijuana as if it were the same kind of drug as heroin has been. And states have opted out in many, many different innovative ways. Some have said, we're not going to arrest people. We're going to give them a little traffic ticket. Some states have said, well, we're going to keep it a criminal misdemeanor, but we're going to give them a court summons, and they'll just come to court and pay a multi-$100 fine. Other states have said, well, it's going to be on the books as a misdemeanor, but our practice is going to be to sentence people to probation. Other states have said, well, if it's a small amount, we're going to give them a conditional discharge if they behave themselves for a year or take it off their record. Then over time, states passed more radical legislation like these medical marijuana laws that we've had over the last 10, 15 years. Then things got even more radical with the emergence of actual commerce with the dispensary movements. Now we have a new phase with these laws in Washington and Colorado. States have been slowly opting out. Now, on one level, federal prohibition has persisted, it still exists, it's still on the books, it's still a major factor, it's still a major facet of federal drug law enforcement and so on. So the federal approach has tolerated a lot of innovation and a lot of opting out. So we have a conflict there between two different trends in drug law enforcement. We need a federal solution. We need a framework that covers everyone in this country. We need it for economic reasons. We need it for drug control reasons. I mean, I think most Americans would agree that we want a way to discourage or prohibit or limit teenage access to marijuana because it does have some abuse potential and so forth. We need an effective way to regulate and or control this drug. And I would argue that the current federal prohibition, there really is no drug control. We need a federal program. And to me, the innovation we've had in the states has been building political, public, economic support for reform that balances or is a counterforce to those people who advocate continuing prohibition. But I think we need a federal solution to this. I think that the efforts we've had in the states have put more and more pressure, ever mounting pressure on the federal government. And frankly, I think that most of the national reform groups are looking for every angle they have, every opening they have, every opportunity they have to press for some kind of federal law. They are in touch with Congress. They are in touch with government officials. They do try to get this story into the national media. I think that our advocacy groups are very opportunistic. There are always areas where their efforts can improve, and they're looking for those areas to improve. But I think they're working on both fronts.
Okay, now you're a former head of NORML. So what I hear you saying is that it's not like NORML and the Drug Policy Alliance and the MPP and ASA aren't working on both state and federal issues. You're sort of saying that maybe the media just covers their work on the state issues more than it covers how they are targeting the repeal of prohibition?
Yes, absolutely. Now, my work with NORML was over 20 years ago. I have good contacts with people that are involved in this field. I sort of monitor what's going on. But I'm long removed from, the day-to-day work in this issue. But, for example, again, I mentioned these hearings that Senator Leahy is having, in mid-September. I think that's, quite an accomplishment, and that just didn't happen by accident. That happened because of, a national advocacy group. So working with him, working with his staff, maintaining a high profile for this issue on Capitol Hill. Also, I think as we get more medical marijuana states, the representatives of those states become advocates for reform in this area. And so, for example, the congressional delegation from California is very concerned about this issue. And I think that holds up for all the other medical marijuana states. As state reform expands, we get more stakeholders. And we get more stakeholders who have credibility and more stakeholders who have political influence. And I think that bodes well for reform in the future.
Great. Okay, now you personally, you've been indulging your interest in criminal justice since 2007 when you published your last major paper, but it seems like in your latest High Times online column, you've recommitted to writing about the economics of pot, or pot economics, as we like to say at Cannabis Commerce. What prompted you to make that to recommit yourself at this time?
Well, I'm sort of from the old school cannabis reform, where we had a lot of idealistic ideas about what marijuana legalization would be right. We had a lot of utopian ideas, and to me, we're in the ugly phase now. What I mean by that is rampant commercialization, and I don't think that's wrong or evil, but I do think that right now, looking ahead to the next 5 or 10 years, right now, a lot of people are getting involved in this issue for the money. A lot of states, a lot of governments, a lot of politicians are looking for revenue streams. A lot of people are looking at the marijuana market as like, oh boy, ground floor. I want to get in on this and I can make a fortune. Now, we live in a capitalist country. This is what we do. But the commercialization of marijuana and monetizing the marijuana market, turning marijuana into a profitable commodity, turning it into a revenue stream for governments, this is really where the action is in the next 4 or 5 years. I'm not saying that the political battles are over. I'm not saying that marijuana's legalization is by any means inevitable. But like I say, the number of stakeholders is expanding, and I think the really interesting area to observe over the next several years is this commercialization of marijuana. So I just think that's really a good topic to focus on, and a lot of my work in terms of research the last 5 years has been on arrest statistics and the demographic. Listen, black people get arrested at 4 or 5 times the rate as white people do, and the same trend holds for Hispanics. And my colleagues and I have been publicizing that. We found a lot of interesting, a lot of nonprofits and advocacy groups are very interested in this issue, and that's been building support in minority communities for marijuana law reform. And I expect to continue work in that area. But in terms of public policy, rather than criminal justice, but in terms of public policy, I think the business development aspect of this is a fascinating area, and it's one that I intend to write about more.
Well, great, and thank you so much for visiting with us today, John. I really appreciate your time and look forward to hearing more from you on this subject. So you'll be working on the amount of cannajobs there could be and more tax projections as well?
I certainly hope to, and yes, this is an area that I hope and expect to spend more time on in the near future.
Thank you so much. Take care, John.